I am a 28-year-old male living in the Deep South. I am now a functional, medicated and therapy-attending paranoid schizophrenic. However, I wasn't always this way. And this story comes from a time before I ever even knew what was wrong. It was about April 2007 when this happened. I had just come out of a painful divorce and she had taken all of my friends away from me in the process. I was obviously trying to reach out to anyone I could, but I had severe codependency issues that I didn't know how to address. Anyway, I found myself wandering the game section of my local Walmart, as I'm still a gamer at heart, and had to see what was available. Things were going alright, and I seemed to be in control of myself. And then he appeared. This poor, unsuspecting soul started talking to me about World of Warcraft, which I happened to play. I perked up at this point, thinking I could make a friend. A new friend that hadn't been taken from me. We made casual jokes and talked about the new expansion. I can't remember if it had just come out or if it was soon to come. At this point, his mother, he was probably about 18 to 20, judging by his appearance, came by and took him to another aisle. He didn't say goodbye. He just walked off, and like that, our conversation was through. Well, in my mind, we had made a connection. We had bonded. In my sick, twisted state, I thought he would appreciate it if we hung out for a while. So I followed him. I made a point to casually stroll on the aisles that he happened to visit, and strike up conversations with him about different things, jokes, I can't remember. I could tell he was getting creeped out by the third time I had done this. He started getting this deer in the headlights look every time he saw me, and it was starting to become a horror story, though in my eyes it was perfectly natural. At some point, however, his fight or flight must have kicked in, because when I appeared, as soon as I opened my mouth to speak, he screamed, "Leave me alone," and stormed off, dragging his mother as quickly as he possibly could. This was a wake-up call for me, that I was being severely creepy and also a stalker. I realized that this could very well be the behavior that caused my divorce in the first place. I checked myself into a mental institution soon after and got the help that I needed. I am now significantly better, and my relationships with people have improved greatly. I now have good friends and a loving fiancé. And not all creepers mean to be creepy. Some of us just need the proper psychiatric help. On behalf of all the unknowing and good-intentioned creepers out there, I humbly and sincerely apologize for our behavior. It doesn't make it forgivable, but I hope it does give some context as to what goes on in the mind of a creeper. Thank you for your time. The Hester House was a legend passed down from class to class in my high school over the decades. Students and even teachers told a variation of a story about a house belonging to one of the earliest families in our community, in central Pennsylvania, that burned down a century earlier, but reappears with the first full moon in October. The story was based on a real house that belonged to a family which owned much of the land in the county but sold it off for residential and commercial development over the decades. When the house burned down in the 1950s, it took with it the last of the Hester family line. The problem was that no one knew where the house had been. There were some old foundations along the southern slope of Peters Mountain, but none of them could be linked, historically, to such a house. The only history was that of the suburban legend, which evolved over the years. The one thing that remains constant was the promise of a treasure hidden under the floorboards in the house. If you found the house while it existed in our realm, you might find cash, gold, and jewels enough to make you rich. Of course, if you didn't get out of the house before it disappeared, you would go with it and become a ghost inside its walls forever. Of course, this was the excuse used by high school kids over the years to go into the woods up on Peters Mountain, to camp or have a bonfire or really try to find the house. In the 1980s, it was still a time when parents didn't mind their kids being gone overnight, and none of us had cell phones. Overnight games of Dungeons and Dragons were common on weekends, and my gaming group was led by the kid who lived at the base of Peters Mountain. He and his brothers loved the story of Hester House, and as October approached that one year, he took a break to persuade us to leave our tabletop adventure and go on a real one. We were a group of 6 boys aged 16 to 17, and it was easy for us to tell our parents that we were staying over at Cliff's house for a marathon weekend D&D session. But instead, we gathered camping material and agreed to head up to the mountain to a small campsite Cliff knew, and as the full moon rose over the mountain, search for the Hester house. Of these 6 of us, we lost the 16-year-old for lack of permission. We lost 2 more who chickened out. So the 3 of us remaining had to split the gear, which put us behind schedule for the camp. The woods were damp and leaves were already falling across the trail, making the shallow uphill slippery and the steeper climbs treacherous. Getting up in the daylight was going to be fine, but after dark, there would be 2 miles between camp and Cliff's home, and another 3 miles back to town. So we were committed. We reached the clearing where Cliff and his brothers and a lot of Hester House seekers made camp. It was a relatively flat area with a view down the mountain into the trees, but we were totally insulated by trees and cut off from the world by the sound of the forest, with only the regular whistle of a distant train to cut through it. By the time that we reached the camp, we had lost a half hour and scrambled to assemble dry firewood, start a fire, and get the tent pitched. The wind rose from the west and cut through the trees, making our activities difficult. From there, things started to fall apart. There were poles missing from the tent bag, and we could only find a limited supply of dry firewood to get the campfire started. The wind freshened and darkness swept over us as the sun set behind the mountaintop, and clouds approached from that direction. The temperature plummeted from the mid-50s while we worked up a sweat to the low 40s with a chilling breeze. Cliff and I struggled to improvise solutions for the tent, using branches to prop up walls and tying others to trees with a nylon rope. Meanwhile, Keith fumbled and stumbled trying to get the fire lit, resorting to lighting an entire box of matches under the kindling in a gamble to get the fire lit and hot enough to dry out the moist firewood. We knew that any significant rain was going to put it out, and we would be huddled together in our sleeping bags under a sagging tent all night. We abandoned the idea of searching for Hester House and prepared to weather a storm. Once we had established some kind of camp, the rain held off for a while, just bringing a cold drizzle. We took turns maintaining the fire and threw shade at one another for not checking the equipment or planning for the weather, and generally being miserable. As the light faded, we heard movement in the woods around us. Definitely human footfalls through the leaves and underbrush, we decided. It cut through the sound of dry leaves rustling and falling from the whistling wind through the trees and the updraft that blustered up the side of the mountain. Suddenly, a big object landed right in the middle of the campfire, throwing hot embers and burning twigs in every direction, including our tents. The evening brightened in a dance of fireflies over the fire. We stepped out to find out what had happened. Did a tree limb fall? Was it a wet branch popping with boiling water pockets? But it was a rock the size of a basketball. Cliff pointed out to the dark figure standing in the trees on the far side of the fire. It was a tall, husky figure, standing slightly hunched like he was getting ready to charge or run away. Movement through the woods resumed, and we detected 3 other people about 50 feet up and down the mountain around the campsite. The first figure we saw stood motionless for moments. Cliff yelled, more ticked off than afraid, "Who are you guys? Don't mess with the fire." The first figure started laughing. It wasn't another kid. It was an older, raspy laugh joined by other older sounding voices and laughter. A softball-sized rock struck a tree trunk over my head and bounced off to one side. Another sailed over Keith's head and struck the tent, snapping the branch holding up the one side. We scattered. I don't know what the others were thinking, but I wanted to keep trees between me and as many of them as I could. The laughter intensified and more rocks landed in the campsite. I slipped in the wet leaves and slid down towards one of the men, and he rushed forward towards me, arms out. He was wide and slow, juggling as he advanced and laughing like it was the funniest thing he had done all year. He slipped and planted himself face first in the muddy ground. By that time, I had traction and I was heading back up the slope towards camp. I took a small rock to the shoulder, but it glanced off my padded shoulder and I kept moving. I got to the camp and one of the men was standing in front of the fire, his features still in shadow. He pointed at me and roared, "Leave Hester House alone." He then took a couple of burning logs and tossed them into the tent. He ran off, chased by the others in the same general direction. Cliff and Keith rushed back. The tent was a loss, we had to smother it, and then it began to rain. A wall of rain rushed in from the west and it poured so hard that it put out the fires and left us in darkness. We huddled together to be able to talk over the rain. Are they gone? Where'd they go? What did we do? We had flashlights and, while cold and soaked, we were uninjured. We gotta get out of here. We heard footsteps in the darkness and a single beam of light shot out from the forest over us. The voice from before screamed, "Leave the Hester House alone! Get out of here or we'll kill you!" We abandoned our gear except for our flashlight, and Keith led us away from the site down the mountain. We were moving at half the speed coming up. It was sloppy and slippery, and the rain was relentless. We slid on our butts over these steep parts and had to stop to work out a way down that wouldn't risk breaking our legs or necks. Every time that we stopped, a rock would sail between us and snap against other rocks or a tree, and a voice would shriek at us to, "Go, go! I will bury you on this mountain. I want the skinny one. She's cute." A rock hit Keith in the cheek and nearly sent him over an incline, but he dropped to his knees to keep from rolling. It dazed him, but his adrenaline kept him moving as the skin swelled and darkened. I said the first thing that I thought of to Cliff. "If these are your brothers and your friends, Cliff, I will be so pissed." Cliff shook his head. "Not them. They would never do this." And I believed him. But most of the town dating back a generation or more did know about the Hester House story and the date. It would be easy for someone with bad intentions to come out into the woods on the first full moon and wait for a bunch of stupid, unprepared kids to make a camp far from witnesses. Suddenly, the stories about kids going missing inside the Hester House trying to get the treasure made me think that if anyone actually did go missing on a dark night in the woods, and the house was just a cover story too. A rock hit me between the shoulder blade with the power of a fastball. I felt something pop in my spine, and a sharp shock went up and down my entire body. After what felt like hours in the increasing darkness, dry heaving from the panic and the struggle, coughing and spitting up snot and rainwater, we came to the road close to Cliff's house. There was a man standing under the streetlight by the street. He had the same predatory hunch as the man at the campsite. Soon, 3 or 4 other figures appeared and blocked our way. We stopped and they began moving towards us. Suddenly, our silent prayers were answered when a truck rolled around a corner heading up the hill, and it bathed them in the headlights, blinding them. They were not kids or young adults. These were older men, faces in their 50s or 60s, bloated and wrinkled, covered in dirty clothes and windbreakers. They were ugly, evil-looking men who had worn us down to exhaustion and were ready to strike. The truck did not slow down, but it gave us a break. Cliff pulled us to one side of the path and back into the woods, along a smaller, natural path along the road. With a supernatural reserve of strength, we cut through the barbs and brush like rabbits eluding wolves, and came out scratched and scraped across the street from Cliff's house. The porch light was lit and the garage door was wide open. Cliff's dad was working on something inside of the garage. We heard the men chasing us along the road, but once they saw the lights of the house, they stopped. We didn't stop until we were in the garage yelling to Cliff's dad that there were bad men after us. Cliff's dad called the cops. Cliff's mom took us inside, dried us off, and helped tend to our injuries. The cops never found anyone, but they scolded us for being irresponsible enough to go camping in the woods without supervision or preparation. The sergeant there saved his strongest words for Cliff's parents, effectively ending our weekend D&D games. Prevailing wisdom was that it was probably some old guys who lived over the mountain, who just wanted to scare some kids out on Hester House night, and they dismissed our dramatic interpretation of the peril which was, in their minds, the product of our excitement and hormones. The newspaper took a decidedly Halloween approach to the story, spinning it as a tantalizing tale of transient stalking local kids on a camping trip, with who knows what in mind when they caught us. But weird Hester House guardians in the woods. It's been 30 years, but if I'm ever in the neighborhood again, I hope we never meet. About a year ago, me and some friends went out to celebrate my birthday. After going to a movie, one of my friends asked if I wanted to go out to the club and bar with her. I said sure, but everyone else wanted to get home as they had to work the next day and were tired and so on. My friend Katie, her cousin Megan, and I headed to the club. We were having a good time, dancing, drinking a little bit, whatever. And then Katie saw a cute guy who she wanted to get with. She started steering our group over to his group, which was conveniently made up of him and 2 other dudes. We all get to chatting and it's relatively innocent. And then the boys asked us if we wanted to go to a bonfire at their work. And they said a bunch of people would be there and it would be fun. I was a little nervous, but Katie was really feeling this guy, so I decided why not. We left the club and we followed the 3 guys about 20 minutes away. We drove in a car, but we each had DDs. The distance was starting to really sketch me out, but I tried to stay relaxed. We pulled up to this huge chain wire fence with a gate, and the guys typed in a code on a box that's open the gate. We drove through and the gate closed behind us. I looked around but saw no bonfire and no other people. Now, I was really starting to get scared. We were in a solitary, enclosed space with 3 strange men, but everyone was smiling and laughing as we got out of the car, and I figured I was probably being paranoid. The boys said that their coworkers had bailed and that they were sorry. I asked where we were, and Katie's guide told us that they were at a haunted house, not the paranormal kind, but the fake Halloween kind, which was currently out of season since it was May. He worked there in the fall, but he had a code. He asked us if we wanted to take a tour through the house and see the behind the scenes of how it all works. I thought that sounded really cool and we all agreed. He led us into the actor's room where the scarers would hang out. A door in it led to this sort of maze of back pathways, where actors could run through the house unseen and jump out in various locations at visitors. Now, I should mention that by this point, the 3 guys had each selected a girl with whom they were trying to score with. The guy who had chosen me, Brian, was average looking, about 6 foot tall and had dark hair. He seemed a little odd, like he didn't really know the other 2 that well, but they were all friends, so whatever. As we begin walking through the main pathway of the haunted house, Megan and the guy that she's with disappears in the back pathways. Suddenly, all the lights go off, fog appears, and the music and noises of the house start. I know that the 2 of them had gone off and turned the house on, but that didn't make it any less scary. I was now in an off-season haunted house along with 3 strange guys, one of who was using the darkness as an excuse to grab onto me, even though I kept pushing him off. I held onto the back of Katie's shirt, scared to death that I would lose her in the maze of hallways and be stuck alone with Brian. I was desperate to get out of the haunted house, unsure where Megan or the guy that she was with were, or if they were going to pop out and scare us or if she was even okay. but it felt like no matter where we turned, we weren't moving anywhere. We kept passing through the same room with a fake sarcophagus in it. I thought to myself, how the heck can I get out of this thing? Katie and her dude were obviously having a lot more fun than I was, as they giggled and walked ahead of us around a corner. When I followed them around the turn, they were gone. Now, I was truly alone with Brian. He wrapped his arm tightly around my waist and I pulled back, saying, "Hey, I'm really scared. I want to get out of this house. How do we get out?" He told me that he didn't know. I responded, "Don't you work here?" "No," he said. "I just met those two guys at the club tonight." Alarms were sounding in my head, and I was in full panic mode. I took my phone out of my pocket and I texted Katie, "Where the heck are you? I want to get out of here," before I started pushing my way through the rest of the house. Finally, after what felt like hours of endless turns and hallways, and Brian grinding accidentally against me and asking me, "Why are you freaking out? Relax," I found the exit door. As I pushed through it into the open air of the outdoors, I felt a little better. Outside of the haunted house, I tried to reason with myself that these guys were probably harmless and I was being silly. I checked my phone, but Katie hadn't texted me back. I decided that I was going to sit by the car and wait for them to return from wherever they were. Brian kept trying to talk me into walking with him somewhere else, but I refused. He checked his phone and said, "Oh, so-and-so texted me. He and Katie are out by the lake. You want to go there?" I desperately wanted to reunite with my friend, who had the car keys, and get the heck out of there, so I agreed. We headed down a dark path towards the lake, and when we got there, I didn't see anyone. I called out for Katie, but I heard no response. Brian said, "Oh, they must have left already and gone back to the house or something. I'll text so-and-so to come back." I sat down on the picnic table to wait, and that's when Brian made his move. He sat beside me and then leaned over and aggressively kissed me, placing my hand on his groin, which was rock hard already. I pulled back and politely said, "No thank you, I'm not in the mood." He tried again and again and I said no. "Come on, just for a bit," he urged, placing my hand once more in his crotch. I stood up and I walked a few steps away, shaking my head. Brian's expression changed. His eyes darkened and his mouth set into a hard line. He stood up and he started pacing in back and forth in front of me. "You've been freaking leading me on all night, you tease. Why the heck do the other two get girls who are DTF while I'm stuck here with you? All you girls are the same. I'm not good enough and I've never been good enough." And then he turned to look at me and said something that sent shivers down my spine. "You know, a lot of guys wouldn't be so nice to you, out here all alone. A lot of guys wouldn't give you a choice." My phone beeped as he finished speaking and I looked down to a text from Katie saying, "We're in the back office watching a movie. We've been here the whole time. Come join." Katie had never been at the lake. Brian had made that text up to get me out here alone. At this point, I was more frightened than I had ever been, and I didn't want to give that away. I didn't want to give Brian the satisfaction of knowing that he had scared me. So I turned and walked back to the haunted house with Brian about 10 feet behind. When I got back to the office, I told Katie and Megan, who were cuddled up on the floor with the two other guys, that I wanted to leave, and Katie promised that we would in a few minutes. I asked for the car keys at least so I could sit in the car and avoid Brian, who was standing in the office corner with his arms crossed. I went to the car and sat in the back seat with the doors locked for over an hour, texting Katie every few minutes begging her to hurry up. It was now 4:30 a.m. and I was scared, tired, and cold. At one point, Brian walked towards the car from the office, standing about 8 feet away and just staring at me. I kept the doors locked and avoided making eye contact. Finally, at 5 a.m., Katie and Megan walk out to the car and we leave. I get home and I pass out from exhaustion. When I wake up, I have a Snapchat friend request. When I check it, it's from BrianX21. Apparently Katie thought that we had hit it off and gave him my Snapchat name. Needless to say, I blocked his Snapchat and I no longer speak to Katie. I was lucky that nothing truly bad happened that night. But when I think of what could have been, when I think about Brian's voice and the veiled threat behind his words, my heart still skips a beat. So Brian, I sincerely hope I never meet you again.